Welcome back to Octagon, and basically your chance to view the insides of the bedrooms and offices of basically all your panelists around the world. I mean, that's why we're doing it online, right? So this session is all about, let me get my notes right up so I get the right title for you. This is Howling Laughter, the intersection of comedy and horror. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read out our panel's description, and then we'll all introduce ourselves, and then we will get on with the questions. Just to remind you folks that you can interact and ask questions via the Twitch. We have a lovely assistant who will be forwarding on any of your questions to us. And after the conversation is over, after this, you can try and join us in the Discord as well. So there is a channel set up on Discord for us, Howling Laughter. And if anyone's interested in carrying on the conversation, we will be there. So the panel description, why is screaming so close to laughing, surprise so close to shock? Why does comedy so often fill in the gaps in tales of horror? From Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein through Scream all the way to Happy Death Day. These two great flavors of entertainment that seem contradictory prove to be a winning combination time and time again. Are the audiences just here to see the juggling of the opposing forces of fear and joy, or is there a deeper truth to be found in how we deal with subjects too terrifying for the rational mind? Now, I'm your host, Robert J.E. Simpson. I'm a film historian and horror critic. I used to work for Hammer Films, and I have just published a book on The Wicker Man, which is available on Amazon and all sorts of other interesting places. And with Dr. Rachel Kelly, who actually is on our panel today, I am part of Cinepunk, a Belfast-based organisation, and we talk all about film and have a podcast and all sorts of fun things. Now, let's have a look at the rest of our group. We've got three of our panelists here. We may have a fourth joining us. They're possibly running late, or possibly not coming at all. I can't tell. So let's start off with Anthea. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Hey there. So I'm Anthea West. I'm a comic creator, writer, artist, letterer, the whole shebang, living in Dublin, up in the mountains, scary, spooky mountains where deers croon and foxes scream. I self-publish comics, and I also do an ongoing webcomic called Fate. And I also work part-time night security. That's me.
Okay. Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Newman. I'm a novelist and critic. I'm starting to wonder if there's a really small pool of people doing these panels. Panels with every single one of you. What happened to the rest of the people? Did no one show up or put their names down? Or indeed, are you the only people who would work with me?
That's quite possible. I don't think so, Kim. Everyone wants to work with you. You know that. Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm a science fiction author and film theorist. That classic career combination. As Robert says, I'm involved with Cinepunk, which aims to bridge the gap between film academia and film fandom. I've got a PhD in film theory. I was not actually cool enough for that to be in horror. I leave that one to Robert, who's the horror expert of the two of us. But I just have a really dysfunctional relationship with horror movies. I love them, but my preferred method of viewing them is from behind my hands.
Fair enough. And Dilman has joined us. Dilman, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh yeah, sorry I'm late. Yes, I'm Dilman Dila. I'm a writer and a filmmaker from Uganda. Most of my works are, of course, science fiction and fantasy stuff, but I write also quite a bit of horror stuff. But I was really interested in this panel because horror in Uganda is traditionally comedy. Most of the stories that we tell ourselves to scare ourselves end up making people laugh. And yeah, I think probably there should be more research on this phenomena, but yeah, I hope to have a good chat with all of you about it.
Well, that's a really interesting way to start. I didn't know that about Ugandan horror at all. So the first question is a very, very basic one, and I'm going to start with you, Dilman, seeing as you've a rather probably different slant on this. Is does horror work without comedy?
I think there is really a very thin line between horror and comedy, and normally the things that make us scared are the same things that will make us laugh. Because in comedy, there is pain, and where there is pain, like you laugh at other people's pains. So you have this this thing like you're laughing. You're not laughing at the person maybe because I made a joke, but because they are hurting. Maybe I'll give an example of some of the horrors in Uganda, and this is like a story. It's kind of a joke. Maybe it's a black humor kind of joke that comes from. It was a story that was passing around during Idi Amin's time. And if you know Idi Amin, he was supposed to be this really horrible dictator. And a lot of people died in his regime. So one of the jokes I had as a child was like, there's a girl who was dating a soldier, and then the soldier, like young girls want material things. They want money, they want clothes and nice bags and all that. So she kept pestering the soldier to buy for her all the nice things that he could. She didn't want, and then the soldier one time got upset, and he took her to a site where he told her, "I'll take you shopping for whatever you want." But he took her to a place where they dumped bodies. And so it was kind of like a mass grave. And he told her, "Yep, here is a shopping center. Pick whatever you want and, go be happy." So when they will tell this story, of course, they will start telling the story like it's a sad and a horrible thing that used to happen during Idi Amin's time. It has connotations of horror in it. But then at the end of it, you laugh when he tells the woman to pick stuff from the mass grave. So there was that. It's a weird thing, like a very thin line there,
Rachel, any thoughts?
I mean, I think there are two sides of the same coin, certainly, and I definitely have to agree with Dilman. And there's a very thin line between horror and comedy, but I think horror can absolutely work without comedy. I can think of a number of horror films which are very, very, very light on the laughs, but work very successfully in terms of scaring the absolute pants off me. But equally, I mean, I think it's instructive to think of the two of them together. Gather Hitchcock always talked about Psycho as a comedy, where I suppose he's talking about the overplaying, the grotesque side of it, but he talks about the fact that you've got to have those two warring impulses, really, the urge to laugh as well as the urge to scream.
Mm-hmm. Kim?
I think what he meant was Psycho is a comedy because it doesn't take seriously the things you're supposed to take seriously, including like sacred American things like money and motherhood, enterprise, Christmas. Everybody forgets Psycho set at Christmas. Whereas quite a lot of Hitchcock's other stuff is deliberately comic in terms of going for laughs as well as horror. And there is that. There's also Grand Guignol, gruesome body horror that's supposed to be funny, which I always think of stuff like Punch and Judy shows. Is that really children's entertainment? Wife beating and the people being fed to crocodiles and murdering policemen and hangmen, all that kind of stuff. And yet that's traditional British children's humor, almost. I think it may well have been more or less eliminated now. But there, even if you look at the Victorian melodramas, Hiss the Villain type stuff, the things that Todd Slaughter made films of, Sweeney Todd is a perfect example of something that's an urban legend. And you can take seriously. There are very serious versions of Sweeney Todd, but it is still turning people into pies and selling them in the shop next door, which is irresistibly a funny idea.
Anthea?
I agree and disagree. like you can mechanically make a horror film that has no comedy within it, and yes, it does. Yeah, it will scare you clearly, but for myself, anyway, in my opinion, I feel that horror crossed with another emotion will always resonate better. So a horror with laughter will stick with me more than just a pure horror, because once the fear is gone, you know, the you know, human mind and everything kind of eventually will forget a fear that is not bound in any sort of reality, because it's, oh, this scary thing won't actually happen to me, so I've forgotten it. But if it's attached to another emotion, it more likely to stay within my memory. Like a show, you know, The Haunting of Bill Manor. I know I've forgotten the title, but
Bly Manor.
thank you. That show stuck with me. Now I found its first season of it, the other one was much scarier, but I find the second one stuck with me because it had a much more emotional story and a much more emotional ending, and it stuck with me. And like laughter and horror are, like, I feel are like the like instinctual basic human emotions. Like they're one of our emotions we've had since we crawled out of the water soup, because we get scared, something bad happens, and unless we're dead, sometimes we just start laughing, because laughter is a sign that we are still alive. So when the horror has passed, you laugh because you're still alive. And if the horror is still there, you're scared. But once the horror is ended, you're laughing. It's literally, I feel that they're on the same path line of emotions. So some of the best comedies are comedy horrors, and I think some of the best horror works so well with comedy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the earliest sound horror films, The Mummy, at the very beginning of that, where the Boris Karloff, the mummy, comes to life, and the archaeologist who's in the room starts laughing and then just doesn't stop laughing for the rest of his life. That was originally done just as a contrast, because even though horror films had only been around a year or two, it was already a cliche that people screamed when the monster appeared on screen. So here they broke the mold and had somebody laugh when the monster appeared on screen, which is funny and disorienting, and then it's actually scarier than if he'd been screaming. Somebody laughing for the rest of their life is much more upsetting than somebody screaming for the rest of their life. I also remember this in comics. There's a moment in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing where they're talking about terrifying things happening all over the world. And they cut to Arkham Asylum, and somebody says, you know what's really scary? The Joker has stopped laughing.
Yeah. I mean, I've always kind of assumed that within, particularly within horror films, I mean, it's about trying to build up and the emotions. And if you're sitting, as Anthea sort of said, if you're sitting there scared the whole time, I mean, you've nowhere to go from that. Dramatically, you know, you can't always be on that elevated high. At some point you will become numb to it, and the sort of the relief of the comedy moments. I mean, I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a picture of Elsa Lanchester over my shoulder from Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, Bride of Frankenstein nicely plays a lot of comedy in order to kind of maximize the effect of the horrific elements of it. Jimmy Carr has defined comedy as a surprising way to end a sentence. Great horror is often defined by its twists, and surprises is novelty what links the two genres. Rachel.
What links the two genres?
It is novelty what links the two genres?
You're asking for a full theory of comedy and horror here, aren't you?
No, not at all. You tell me what you're comfortable with.
Okay, so
Deadline's end of the paddle.
Sorry.
Like a double spaced.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess yes. I mean, the two genres are obviously clearly linked. You know, and when we talk about genre and genre conventions, I mean, what defines both horror and comedy, unlike say a Western or unlike say science fiction, is that both horror and comedy are defined by the emotion that they're designed to evoke. You know, there's genre conventions for both of them, but you know, they're iffy and they're tricky and they're slippery in a way that the other sort of physical, tangible genre conventions are not. And I suppose, you know, depending on what theory of comedy that you subscribe to, you know, you could say that both horror and comedy are, you know, they are defined by something that is wrong, something that's not right, or something that is surprising, as you say, it's unexpected, and how we react emotionally to them. And I do think it's really useful to remember that, you know, when horror fails, when it doesn't frighten us, the most common reaction is to laugh and to find it ridiculous rather than horrifying. So yeah,
that's a bit tough on comedy, because when comedy fails, there's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. I want to kind of feed this into the next question as well, because I think the two actually fit quite well together. And it says, as Mel Brooks said, tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die. And how important is the distance from the audience to the subject in determining what increases tension and what releases it? I think those two things probably sort of fit together reasonably well. Kim, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that particular example also has an application to horror, in that when they did the audience reaction tests after the John Carpenter version of The Thing came out, people said the thing that most upset was the guy having his finger cut open. Because they could relate to that more than somebody's head to, sprouting spider legs or, dog's face. But that one moment where everybody cuts their finger in order to fill the little beaker with blood that they can test is the thing that most upset people. Something small, in the way that things, I don't know, the torture by dentist scene in Marathon Man sticks in your mind a lot more than all the more extravagant, disgusting horror scenes you've seen, because it's relatable. If you want to really upset people, find little things in their lives that they're nervous about, or is that? I mean, actually, I think it's a pretty good formula for horror of all time. Is if you just think about stuff that everybody has to deal with all the time and come up with a horrific spin on it. There's a very fun 1980s horror film called The Lift, which is all about lifts, and of course everybody hates them. It's something everyone relates to, that thing where you get in a lift and it lurches a bit, or the doors don't quite shut properly, and you have this horrible flash of, oh my God, I'm going to be stuck in here forever. I'm in this metal coffin in a building. That's a much more relatable than, I don't know, going to Castle Dracula, which, not that many people do in their lives.
Anthea.
Yes. Horror and comedy are so connected because they're both very what's the word where it's different for each person, like subjective, yes, subjective. I feel like horror and comedy can both be very subjective. What would be scary for one person is not going to scare another. What's funny for one person is not going to be funny for another way. But like both horror and comedy both rely on the sense of tension and anticipation, then punchline. And the punchline is, we all know what a punchline is for a joke, but in horror, it's also when the monster pops out, when the body is discovered, when the guy goes, ooga booga booga. That's the punchline of horror. But you need the tension, and you need the anticipation, and you need that moment of silence. Then you get the punchline. And that works in both horror and in comedy. You have to have both of those elements to really drum up a good ending to your punchline.
Mm. I mean, Kim's just talked there about the notion about a lift. I mean, so even that, I guess, does that become a more horrifying and more comedic potential? Does that have more comedy, more horror potential because it's something that we recognize? Whereas,
it's an observational stand-up routine that can also be a horror story.
Yes, like the setup is guy's going to work. He goes in the same elevator twice. Both times the elevator's not working. And the first time he goes in it shudders. Second time he goes in it stalls. And it's building up to something, and he's always late for work. Third time he goes in, he's like, can't be late for work this time. This elevator better be working. He opens the elevator, he walks in, falls to his death because the elevator is out of order and it's being fixed. And that can either be a horror or a comedy, depending on who's looking at it. But that all relies on setup, anticipation, punchline.
Never thought of horror as a kind of as a comedy routine before, but that's going to change how I think about stuff. I got to be honest. Dilman, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's what really Anthea is saying about the setups and the punchlines, because everything, both genres really depend on drawing the audience into, or the reader into the story, so that they can either laugh or feel scared for themselves. I think both of them heavily rely on suspense, because without suspense, you're not going to get the joke. Like if you know the punchline before the setup, then you're probably not going to laugh. And same with horror. Like sometimes you might know, okay, there is a monster in there, and then it hits the person, and you won't feel, satisfied watching such a film or reading such a book. It will make you feel cheated in a way. And I think some of the really bad horror films and horror books written in that way, like where there are monsters in the wood, children go to the wood, they get eaten, and that's it. And yet the really good horrors are those that, you don't really know what's coming, and so they build it up, or they lead you gently to the story, and then by the time you realize it, you're into the story, and then you're scared when the punchline comes in. Though of course both also will work in the sense of, like she says, there's a lot of subjectivity to it. So if you're watching a film with Freddy Krueger, you get scared when you see him, because you already know what this guy is all about. And if you're watching a Charlie Chaplin film, even without him doing anything, you might start laughing at some point. So the subjectivity comes from the audiences knowing the content and knowing the context of what both the humor and the scare is supposed to be, and that helps a lot, in both cases. Compared with other genres like drama, you probably don't need suspense, you don't even need to know the context, and you still enjoy it. And even science fictions and maybe fantasies, you can go along without heavily relying on context and the suspense and the build up to it.
I just want to put in a question from the audience. So Temporal Anomalies KL on Twitch has asked, did Tom Savini have an effect on visual horror, or was it a continuation of that need to find something relatable? Anyone want to talk about Tom Savini? He's a makeup artist and an actor, and was very involved.
Directed a film as well.
Yeah, so he did the comedy version of Night of the Living Dead, and is very involved with a lot of that sort of splatter-esque kind of horror. But he treads that line between the horror and comedy quite admirably. Kim, I think I'm going to have to come to you for this one.
Certainly, he's an interesting filmmaker. I don't think of him as particularly a comic creative, although I do remember that George Romero quite often would refer to the effects that Savini did as gags or jokes. And there are, in Dawn of the Dead, for instance, there are sort of gruesome things which are also funny. The helicopter slicing off the top of a zombie's head like a breakfast egg, that kind of stuff. or there's in Day of the Dead, there's a head which is treated like a bowling ball. Although that's not something that Tom Savini has a monopoly on. I mean, it was a particular type of gruesome horror that was around a lot in the 80s. I think it has a lot to do with physical effects. I also associate it with Rob Bottin, who did The Thing, or Rick Baker, who did American Werewolf in London. I think you don't see that kind of gore gag done much with CGI. No. I don't know, maybe the people who work on computers are less likely to have the sick humor. The people who have to sculpt it all in rubber and squirt ketchup on the floor tend to, which probably does go back to the Grand Guignol theatre, which were full of gouged out eyes and brains thrown all over the screen, all that on the stage, which was designed in the way that custard pie fights are. A sort of official comedy. In fact, there's a custard pie fight at the end of All the Dead. So.
Okay. I hope that answers your question. So are there folk tales that were intended to be humor that we now read as horror, or vice versa? Anthea, I'm going to come to you for that one.
Well, when it comes to Irish mythology, Irish folklore, just Irish stories in general, I think our best cinematics, our best films are always Black comedies. We are so good at Black comedies in this country, I feel. And I think that really kind of relates to a lot of our folklores and such. Because a lot of our folklore, I was talking a bit about this on the panel yesterday with Kim, that a lot of our folklore kind of boils down to, you did the thing, you shouldn't have done the thing, and now you're a donkey or you're dead, and a lot of our things drum down to that. And like kind of what Dilman was saying, like there is always that sense of horror and that sense of comedy in our old stories, because they were always told phonetically. They were all shared vocally to one person to another person. And when you're with a group of people, like I feel like when you're in a group of people and you're telling any sort of story, at some point you're going to get people laughing. If you're trying to scare them, they're also going to start laughing eventually as well. Because I feel like as human beings, we just do that. We can go from laughter to horror just so quickly. And with our folklore can just get so dark and then just go so bizarre and funny at the same time. Because a guy, he was the best bard in the land in the county, and he played for the fairies, and the fairies were like, oh, you're so good, and he's like, haha, yeah, I am so good, I'm better than you fairies. And then the fairies turned his face into an ass or something like that. And it's here's your moral: don't be telling fairies you're better than them at things. And there's your horror: you have an ass for a face. And there's also your comedy: you have an ass for a face. So I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with it.
Dilman.
Yeah, I think like what Anthea said, folk tales sort of, they also depend on the generation and on the time that they are being told. So we might find like some folk tales today looking funny, and yet back in the day they were not funny. They were actually scary, given the situation of the people found themselves in. So if it's in a world where people really believe in fairies, then it's going to get scary that your face will be turned into an ass. But in a world where the power of fairies has been turned into storytelling, basically, it has been reduced to that. You will laugh at that story, and I think it just comes down to the what the context, the way I said before, context and how people associate with the materials. Like even in Uganda, you find there are many stories about zombies about people eating zombies. And you know, like you hear these stories and it's supposed to be a cannibal story. And maybe back in the past, it really scared people. But today, it's always like a punchline. And at the end, at the point where they tell you about somebody almost being eaten, or somebody almost eating a zombie, or somebody being turned into a zombie, there's a moment of laughter at some point somewhere. And I think it's because the reality of when these stories were started turning up, and then the reality of the present have sort of changed a lot, and the context is no longer the same. Yeah.
I'm going to push this on a wee bit because we've got a couple more audience questions as well, and I'd like to incorporate them if we can. But one of the things that we've talked about in just even the description for this panel was about how some horror franchises have leaned more into the comedy the further into the sequels that they've gone. The example I think that was used there was Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein, which if you've not seen, well, maybe that's a good thing. Is it possible to go back to horror once you've embraced comedy, Rachel?
Is it possible to go back to horror as a franchise once you've embraced comedy?
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. I think, yeah. I mean, I think absolutely. I think it's difficult, possibly. I mean, this is a really free-form answer, okay? It's not something I've considered in any depth, but I mean, I think you see it all the time. You see slates wiped clean in franchises and rebooting. And, you know, classic example is Batman. I mean, how ridiculous had Batman got by Batman and Robin? But then, you know, the next iteration of that is the Nolan Batman, which is a completely different, I mean, as such a complete tonal about turn. So why not? You know, I think you probably do kind of get yourself caught into a groove of, you know, if you've got into over the top horror that has just got more and more ridiculous and self-referential. I think you probably do need to clear the slate and go back and restart. But why ever not? I'm sure there are more examples than Batman out there. Whereas the franchise is sort of fallen into slightly, you know, ridiculous over the top territory, but goes back to straightforward, you know, gritty horror. Somebody help me out.
Kim, are you a fan of Abbott and Costello?
Actually, they're probably my least favorite comedy team in the 1940s. I mean, the Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters films are kind of fascinating. And I love, Bob Hope in The Cat and the Canary and loads of other comedians in a haunted house film. I think actually some of the earlier Abbott and Costello films were brilliant. But actually, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is one of their less funny films, but it's got really good monsters in it. I think, I mean, it used to be said that, you know, that run, because Abbott and Costello met Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Mummy, and then they went to Mars. That run of films kind of killed off the classic Universal monsters. They did an Invisible Man movie as well. And that was in the late 40s and early 50s. But then Hammer Films in the late 50s came along and basically did all those stories again and said, what if we took it seriously? And then after 10 years of those, you started getting parodies. And in fact, the Universal monsters, I think it wasn't so much Abbott and Costello, because those films present the monsters quite seriously. It was the Monsters, was where you take these great figures of horror, Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, the werewolf, and they're a sitcom family, and they're lovable, and they're harmless. And even because it was a Universal show, the makeup of Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi is parodied in The Monsters. And that, I think, you know, literally defanged those characters for a long time. Maybe those versions of the characters, which are still in many ways the defining pop culture images of those characters, still haven't quite got over the monsters. But they ought to, because they're still scary ideas. They're still, these monsters or franchises or stories, they wouldn't be so often told if they didn't work. If there wasn't something deep in the story of Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Phantom of the Opera, Jekyll and Hyde, The Mummy. If there wasn't something going on in those stories, we would have just abandoned them after one or two films in the 1930s. But the fact is, every year, all of those characters get another movie. Or every couple of years, somebody goes back. I mean, last year there was an Invisible Man movie, right? There hadn't been an Invisible Man movie for decades. And there hadn't been a serious Invisible Man movie for quite a long time. And yet suddenly the new version of the Invisible Man thinks of different ways of telling that story and makes you realize, you know what, the Invisible Man is actually one of the scariest characters, rather than somebody from a Disney comedy.
Yeah, funny enough, I was thinking about the Invisible Man a lot. I was watching the Abbott and Costello meet the Invisible Man this morning and comparing that to the Blumhouse reinvention, and it is like day and night in terms of its seriousness. So obviously, I guess, you know, we sort of answered the question. We've got about 10 minutes left of the session here, and I've got a few questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the questions, and I'm going to leave it a little bit more free for all. So if anyone has a strong feeling they want to respond, I'm going to give you the option to leap in. Just don't talk over each other. Okay, so Philidai 2077 on Twitch has asked, that point on CGI and splatter, has that kind of technical proficiency detracted from the emotional effect? So we were talking a little bit about Tom Savini and Rick Baker and physical effects, and how CGI basically doesn't do splatter in the same way. So does that detract from the emotional effect? Any thoughts on this?
Well, sorry, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Anthea.
No, you started first. You go.
I was just going to bring up the haunting of Hill House, the film version of it from what the 1990s, was it? I've almost written it out of my mind. It was so bad, which was just an absolute orgy of special effects and was so completely ridiculous as a consequence. And I don't know how you make the Haunting of Hill House not scary, because in every other engagement I have seen with that text, which is itself a terrifying text, it has been frightening as hell. But that's how you do it, by just going absolutely overboard and chucking all of this special effects technology at the screen. So yeah, I mean, I think the special effects, I mean, equal special effects used to really quite horrifying effects, but I mean, I think it's a question of how it's deployed, and just assuming that, you know, the ability to do weirder stuff with a computer is going to necessarily frighten people. I think you know, if you haven't seen The Haunting of Hill House, don't. It's dreadful. One
thing that does occur to me is I've very rarely seen CGI effects used that are funny. I mean, I think The Mask is the last one I can think of, and that was nearly 25 years ago now. I mean, I've seen CGI effects used well in horror, but there's something about that sort of photorealistic computer perfection that is just not funny, that just can't be used for a gag. Whereas Warner Brothers cartoons are still funny. Yeah, the ones that are drawn on paper are so much funnier than the ones in Space Jam.
I wonder if there's something there about authenticity. Anthea, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, when we see, I have a bachelor's degree in animation, so I know a good bit about pipelines and such like that. And the thing with 3D animation and all that is that it has a very distinct pipeline, where with practical effects, it is there within the reality of the actors. They can see the prop, they can react to it in a much more realistic manner because it's there within their space. But when it comes to 3D, you do the shooting, you do the green screen, and then there's a studio off somewhere else who is modeling. Like, they have to model the creature, and then they have to rig it, and then they have to animate it. And often that is in a completely different space from where the actors had to act towards the creature. And I feel that really affects the performance of the show, of the film, of the horror and the comedy, because it's not there in reality. Like I will always try and justify and, you know, defend 3D animation and 2D animation, because I believe they all have their good parts and bad parts. But unfortunately, I just feel that realistic effects will always work better in the end, because there is that sense of reality. And there's always flaws. There's always a flaw within a realistic prop or a realistic makeup and such. There's some, you can just kind of feel that it's real, and there's some sort of flaw within it. Well, in 3D animation, depending on who's making it, obviously it can be different depending on the pipeline, the timeline, and so on. But there's this smoothness to it, which I feel affects how people perceive it as well. Because if it's too perfect, it goes into the uncanny valley, and it's not even the good uncanny valley where you get the horror. Because like effects with like comedy with like Space Jam and stuff, there's always that little bit of sense of uncanny valley where it's like, that looks a little weird, just a little too human sometimes, when it's supposed to be a cartoon rabbit, and it just doesn't quite work. And it's not supposed to be scary, but it's putting you more towards feeling a bit weirded out than towards feeling the comedy, and you're getting these mixed signals, and it just doesn't work.
We've got about 5 minutes here, so I just want to try and squeeze in one last question from the audience, and that's Mariah Paper has asked, going by how the world has changed during the pandemic, do you anticipate the content of what is considered humor and horror to change over the next few years, and how do you think it will change? And are there any themes that you're looking forward to exploring? That's quite a lot, but I'm gonna ask Dilman what he thinks about this one.
I don't think it's going to change, because human beings are always human beings. We've always had pandemics from the beginning of our civilizations, and we'll always have them. So I doubt we are going to see much of a change. I think in the next few years, we might not have pandemic-related horrors in books and films, as people are maybe fatigued with the kind of that they might want to get away from it. But by the mid-20s, or I mean late 20s, early 30s, you're going to see a lot of stories about the current horror, either in humor or in horror. I mean the current pandemic happening. So I'm not sure it's going to change much. It's just probably just putting people away from pandemic horror for a while, but it's not going to change much.
Do you mind? Sorry, I know I keep over talking, but thinking of that question, during the pandemic, you all know what TikTok is, yeah?
Yes.
Well, look, I'm a 30-something woman, and I've been on TikTok for all of the pandemic, and the Gen Z kids, this new generation, they're fantastic, but they're also a little scary, because they have such a nihilism towards everything in life. And it's fascinating, but also very kind of sad to see, because they've been grown up in an environment where everything is on fire, unfortunately. And it heavily affects them, because it's their future that's being messed up in the future. So they've, like Gen Z kids, Gen Z teenagers, such on, have adapted such this nihilism attitude towards everything, including death. I've seen so many videos of these kids talking about how they are not afraid of death, and they will literally sell their soul for a corn chip. And I feel like if future writers and future filmmakers don't take some sort of advantage of this when it comes to stories that will affect Gen Z kids, like as they're getting older and they're having money in their pockets and buying things, that the usual scares that would have scared us, that would have scared the generation before us, is not going to hit them in the same manner, because they live in such a tremendous, I don't know what word I'm trying to find, but an environment that's pretty much falling around them. The same things are just not going to scare them as they scared us, because they're dealing with climate change. They're dealing with the horrors of high capitalism, no medicals, no bills, mortgages, no one can live anywhere. And it's like you have to be playing with those topics more than you would have dealt with the topics that we would have dealt with. So like there's definitely going to be a lot of like environmentalism stories about like dealing with people who are in power who are not doing anything with a very obvious threat. Like I feel like that's going to be a big theme, is a very, very obvious threat with a very, very obvious solution, but those in authority are not doing anything about it. And that's going to be a theme around their horror stories. They're what will be scaring these kids when they are adults.
That's
So,
a wonderfully nihilistic way of sort of ending our time, because we're basically at the limit, and I'm not, I think if I let you continue, I'm just going to end up doing something horrible to myself.
Yeah, I need to shush.
But we can continue this conversation on Discord if anyone is interested. There is a channel there, Howling Laughter. We'll be on there shortly, and there's a couple of questions that came through as well. I'll post them up, and if anyone wants to get engaged in that, then we can. I'm just going to take advantage since we're excited getting started. Give you all a quick chance to plug whatever it is you're doing at the moment. Kim, want to plug anything?
I have a novel out in about a month called Something More Than Night, an occult mystery set in Hollywood in the late 1930s from Titan Books.
Titan Books, okay, excellent. Anthea?
Ongoing webcomic called Fate. It's not a horror or a comedy. Well, it's kind of a comedy, but it's an all ages fantasy. So that updates on fatecomic.com every week. Currently working on a new graphic novel called I'm a Shepherd, which focuses around ghost and grief. And I'm also working on a horror graphic novel, my first horror graphic novel, about losing memories, but still dealing with the unknowable trauma which comes with it.
Dilman?
I'm working on a short film. I'm always making short films, but I want to do one that is gene drive. If you heard of gene drive technology, I want to make a film about gene drive creating zombie-like human beings. I'm still working it out, and it will be on my Patreon when it's out, probably sometime next year. Yeah.
Right. Rachel?
Yeah, I had the great timing of releasing my debut novel at the start of the pandemic last year. It's called Edge of Heaven. It did get shortlisted for the Clarke Award. It did not win, but the sequel is coming out next year at time to be confirmed.
Very good. And I'm going to replug my book on the Wicker Man, The Willing Fool, which is available on Amazon and also on my Ko-Fi. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you to my wonderful panel, and hopefully we'll see you again at some point. Enjoy the rest of the con.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Bye.